All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us at the 2022 Women in Tech and Innovation Forum. This is our fourth panel of the day. We're very excited about it. It's Adventures in Podcast Production with some of our near and dear friends from the industry and around the state. We have Samantha Lopez from the Creatives Potluck, as well as the Tejanas and Film Collective. She also produced one of our favorites here at the office, Texas Film in Focus. We have Julie Goodgame from the city of Tyler, who has the Roses and Weeds podcast, where she helps to connect her constituents in her community with their local government. We have Frances Román, and she is with the How to Texas podcast, takes folks behind the scenes as far as some of the jobs that are hard at work behind film production and some of the kind of unsung heroes, if you will. And we also have Chantelle James from the Women in Film and Television Austin podcast, where they interview industry professionals from around the state. So thank you all so much for joining us. Just for our audience, please be sure to use the Q&A tab to put your questions in the chat, and our folks behind the scenes will be collecting those and sharing them with our presenters at the end of the discussion. So I hope everyone enjoys.
Awesome. Thanks, Lindsay. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Good afternoon. We're so excited to talk about podcasting. I know it's been one of my favorite things to really dive into during the past couple of years, when we're really just relegated to be at home sometimes with just our thoughts. So we want to cover a lot of different things today, not just kind of podcasting as a medium, but also diving into some of the more specific production-y type of things. And we'll see kind of where the conversation goes. But I think a great place to start is kind of drawing that parallel between filmmaking, media making, communications, and this medium that is podcasting. So I'd love to hear from everyone in the room kind of how you started or how you moved into this space, and kind of what you've found to be of interest and keeps you going. So yeah, Frances, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Frances Román. I'm a filmmaker. I direct and produce films. And with How to Texas, our podcast is all about the people making movies here in Texas, specifically like the crew members behind the scenes that like your average moviegoer doesn't really hear about, right? So each week what we do is we focus on highlighting a crew member that so we're not talking like your Matthew McConaughey's or your Richard Linklaters. We're talking about people who are like stunt performers or animal trainers or casting directors. And we just really wanted to highlight like how special the Texas film industry is specifically, and how talented those folks are that are driving the industry here. And yeah, my co-hosts and I, we all come from the production world, and we wanted an excuse, one, to get back onto set, and two, and most importantly, to really spotlight how special Texas filmmaking is.
How'd y'all land on putting a podcast together?
Oh, so we are all about staying creative. We have my co-hosts and I, Drew Saflin and Samantha Bennett, we have a narrative production company called The Direct Line, and we're all about like staying creative and making projects. And we saw this opportunity on Hyperreal. Samantha, I know that you also worked with the Hyperreal Film Club. Shout out to them. They're super sweet and awesome. And they had a podcasting grant. And so we decided to apply because we had never done podcasting. Like, this is my first podcast. And it was such a special experience because it's storytelling. Like, podcasting is storytelling. And we're so used to working in a visual medium, and with podcasting, you get to really just like challenge that and work with sound and audio and just like the magic of editing in a different way when you don't have to look at it, when it's all about like the surrounding sound.
Cool. Yeah, I love that. I definitely want to come back to the storytelling part, but before we move into that direction, I want to hear from Julie and Chantelle. How did y'all get into the podcasting game, and like where's it taking you so far? Chantelle, do you want to take?
Yeah, absolutely. So I kind of it happened during lockdown when I was, in the dark and figuring out what the hell I could productively do with my time and my life, and how to remain relevant and how to connect with other creatives. Part of Women in Film and Television Austin, they reached out to the membership base and just put out a little ad to see if anyone was interested. And that's how I became involved. I started working with Sam Lopez and also Kelly Coffey and a bunch of other brilliant women, and we created a season 1, which was similar, Frances, to what you were doing with kind of interviewing all types of industry folk, which was really fun. And we found that we really were able to reach a lot of people since people were available. So we got some really cool guests on the show. It was a really great experience. And moving forward into season 2, I'm now the podcast chair and producing and hosting. So,
yeah, and making big moves. Season 2 is coming soon, y'all.
Yeah.
Julie, I'd love to hear your perspective from Tyler, Texas, and the Roses and Weeds podcast, kind of how that came about and how you're using that to really kind of keep the community engaged and up to date.
Yeah, so I'm an accidental podcaster in the sense that a few years ago, our community was trying to stand up its first makerspace. And we had done all these charrettes, and a big part of what the community wanted to see in the space was a podcasting studio. So we actually built out a really neat studio. But we, in order to kind of drive traffic, because if you're familiar with like a makerspace, it's basically you pay like a gym membership fee and you get access to all of these different tools and things like that. So we really wanted to promote the new makerspace. And, we thought, okay, well, let's do our own podcast and we'll show people, how easy it is to come in and use this equipment to, create a podcast. And we had 2 wonderful original hosts that they were into podcasting and had their own stuff that they did for a while. And for our first season, and then they left for greener pastures, North Carolina. But so then we had, it is very green there. So then we had to, so then we were going back for, okay, we've got season 2 that we need to, what are we going to do with that? And I had started out just producing and basically outlining episodes. And then it was like, we need hosts. And so it's like, okay, well, I'll give it a go. And so that's how we moved forward with season 2. Me and another guy on my team just kind of picked that up. And now we rotate in series of different guests and things like that. So it's been a lot of fun.
That's awesome. That's so cool. I too found myself being an accidental podcaster. I feel like that should be like on a t-shirt or a hashtag of some sort, but or the next book you write will be the accidental podcaster. But yeah, definitely kind of along the same lines as Chantelle and Frances, in the sense that, working in the creative space, in the film world, it's like really truly like, how do you flex your creative juices a little bit and challenge yourself to constantly create. So for me, it was definitely one of those things where it was like, well, I'm here and I can do that thing. So let me just really dive into it and see what happens. So yeah, I get into the specifics in my show. My second season of the Creative Potluck podcast launched 2 weeks ago. We have a new episode Wednesday. You're not a real podcaster if you're not constantly promoting, but I talk about kind of
so
how,
true.
Yeah, I talk about kind of how all of these shows happened, and how I just really turned into accidental podcaster. So love that. We can make that the official hashtag, thanks to Julie, of this session. So quick reminder, feel free to hit up the chat. Someone says, I love How to Texas. So go How to Texas team. Also Looking Amazing Girl, which isn't directed to any one of us. So I'll take that as a compliment too. So throw that in. Feel free to chat, and then you have specific Q&A or questions, cues, put that in the Q&A section as well. So to make sure that we see them and get there. So happy to have everybody on. So I'd love to talk a little bit about the nitty gritty, the production aspect of podcasting. I know there's like a million ways to do this and a million ways to get in front of an audience. So I'd love to hear kind of everyone's process and, you know, how you're basically getting from script to, I don't know, Spotify. What is the equivalent to screen, like audio, right? So, yeah, whoever wants to jump in, feel free.
Yeah, okay, I'll go.
Yeah.
Definitely like treat it as you would like a film project. There is a development stage where you're going to think about programming and the types of guests that you're going to want to have on your show, who you have reach and connection to, and then also researching guests. If you're narrative, this is the time you're going to be working on your scripts and getting all your episodes in order. What is your show about? And then physically producing is actually recording. So you want to also figure out like what the best technical equipment is going to be. And yeah, there's a lot of ways to do that, and I'm sure we'll dig in a little deeper to that later. And then
trial and error, right?
And it's trial and error, absolutely. Yeah, and then you want to be, you know, in post, it's editing, it's making sure everything has, you know, quality control, making sure you're delivering on time, how you're going to market your podcast. Yeah, there's a start.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that development stage is super critical in really defining like what your show is, right? Like I, when I was creating Texas Film in Focus with Hyperreal, shout out Hyperreal, I basically did like a brain dump of like, this is, I guess, all of the people that I want on the show. And it ended up being a bunch of sticky notes and then a really big spreadsheet. And then, you know, 45 interviews later, I have this 12-part series. So it is a huge kind of process and undertaking for you to do this big, you know, kind of brain dump of an idea, but it's super important for you to be able to define what your show is so that when you are talking to your guests or potential sponsors, even what that show is and why it's, you know, attractive to people. So definitely in the development stage, that's absolutely something that is going to take a lot of like time and energy. In terms of production, does anyone have any thoughts around like how to seek out the best equipment if you're just starting, like defining what that is, how to get it in your respective areas?
I know. So when we started, we've built out like 2 spaces basically, and they're both completely different. I'm always a big believer in talk to the people who already do this and do this well, and see what they tell you. So that was my first thing was, you know, let me call around and find, you know, and through networks, you know, find people to make recommendations. And then kind of, because like the first space we did, it, you know, it was real beautifully soundproofed and, you know, the big boom arm, you know, mics coming down and a soundboard that was probably better quality than the one we have in our theater. And then when we moved out of that space and moved downtown on our square, like the room is almost all glass and we're very visible to the public. There's no soundproofing. So, you know, we have to take in, there's a lot of audio considerations that we have to make when we're actually doing a live recording. But we did it intentionally because we wanted to be very visible to the public and people to know what was going on in the space. And we actually, so now, you know, we use headsets and things like that instead of, you know, those, you know, boom arm mics and things like that. But I would say just, you know, ask people smarter than yourself or who've been doing it longer to give recommendations and let them know what your price points are. Because mine, you know, I said, look, this is how much money I've got to spend and this is what I need to be able to create. And I got some great advice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really good advice to seek out people who are already doing it. How about y'all, Frances? How did y'all equip your kind of makeshift studio aside from the rugs and the dog proofing?
Yeah, so we for How to Texas, my co-hosts and I, we really leaned into the DIY spirit of it. Also, it was our first podcast for me, and to figure out like what kind of equipment we wanted to use, we actually went with equipment rentals. We used a local rental house, Rock and Roll Rentals here in Austin, and we were able to rent equipment at a pretty reasonable price, also monthly. So I would say, like, going back into pre-pro, just like a film, like, you have to plan, right? Failing to plan is planning to fail, unfortunately. So you just really need to think about, like, okay, I'm going to have this equipment for this amount of time and I want to get these interviews. And then also, like, we rented a shotgun mic for our in-field interviews, but we also did a 3-person studio day after every interview. So if I went out to interview, for example, this really cool, amazing animal trainer, Bobby Colorado, shout out to Bobby Colorado, I came back to the studio to tell Sam and Drew in our little makeshift studio with, as Samantha mentioned, dog proofing. Like, we put down rugs and tried to make the space. We didn't have an actual built out studio, but, you know, we'd love to work in a built out studio if it was available. But just lean into what you have available to you. So I would, you know, ask people who podcast, like, what equipment they use, but also, if you don't need to buy it flat out, try a rental and figure out what you specifically need for your type of podcast.
Yeah, that's really great tips. I also sought out Rock and Roll Rentals. They're really great, like accessible and affordable for those longer term rentals. Also reached out to a couple of friends who I knew were already kind of doing stuff like, hey, you wouldn't happen to have just like a mixer I could use that you're not using. So still have that on loan. But really finding the difference between, like, or I guess what your setup is capable of, right? Like, if you already have a computer, how do you find a mic that matches that? And a lot of Googling, a lot of following podcasters. So yeah, absolutely. Really great tips there. There are a couple of questions in the Q&A. I think one of them, let's see. Some of these we can answer during the Q&A section, but I wanted to circle back to that question, or to the point that Francis brought up about storytelling. So I'd love to hear everybody's take on, like, how unique the podcasting space is when it comes to storytelling, and where there might be kind of similarities and differences in podcasting that there is in film or other ways of creating media.
Yeah, I would say, like, the amazing thing about podcasting is, with sound, you can transport anyone anywhere. And I think from a, like, film production standpoint, that can get more costly, just expensive in general. And I'll use the example for our pilot episode. We interviewed Bobby Colorado, she's the first woman to master animal training in the film and television space. And she happens to be a living legend based here in Texas. So we were able to interview her, and she had this crazy, amazing story about a time in Vegas when she started out in animal training. She was taking care of the MGM lion, right? And it was super cool. And our technical genius on the podcast is my co-host Samantha Bennett. She did a lot of amazing sound design to, like, really take you to Vegas, like, with the sounds of, like, slot machines, the casino, what you think the strip would sound like, and then, like, lion roars. And I feel like you were really transported to the 1970s MGM hotel, versus if it was an actual film and you had that visual medium, it would cost a lot to fly out your crew to Vegas and then also work with a real lion. So it's just the accessibility of the space is really cool, and I think challenges you to, like, find different angles on how to tell your story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I definitely have appreciated it. Like, you know, working in government communications, and our podcast is about local government and basically what's happening in the community or why we're doing certain things. And, you know, people don't read the way that they used to. And for very technical things, that can be very dry. It's hard to get people to pay attention to those. So with the podcast, what we found is we can really get deeper in those issues and discussion, and even kind of use maybe the community controversy or people, you know, like, I always actually like it now when someone is really up in arms about something that the city has done, like on Facebook or Nextdoor, because that becomes a new talking point for an episode, and we can get, you know, really into it. People will engage with it, not always positively, but, you know, like, sometimes you have to like bask in the hatred because it fuels it propels that story forward. And maybe you don't necessarily agree with it, but you have those people listening and, kind of hearing you and understanding things in a different way.
Yeah, I will say accessibility is definitely one thing. Anyone can create an Anchor account and upload a podcast series. Like, it's really very easy to do, and it's very easy for listeners to access any kind of content, any kind of genre, anything they're interested in, which is wonderful and amazing. And it's so easy to listen to because it only takes listening. You're cooking, you're walking your dog, you're driving to work. I think I read something that podcasts are listened to by 52% of all people using the internet between ages 16 to 64. Like, that's crazy.
Oh my gosh, that's such a broad demographic. It's like literally
insane.
Everyone.
Literally everyone.
Yeah. I love that point you made about, like, as you're like cooking or walking or whatever, like the fact that this is almost a more passive medium than having to sit somewhere and watch something. Like, sometimes I won't watch a movie if I know that my mindset is not there to like have all of the attention, but I will throw a podcast on I'm cooking or cleaning and, doing other things and still able to absorb that. I think from the storytelling perspective for me, like, I have such a, I wouldn't say like I have a wide range of different shows that I'm working on that tell stories in different ways. So like for Texas Film in Focus, for example, it was a bit of a mix between interviews and me kind of pulling together the topic we were talking about. So one of the episodes was about movie theaters. And so I did some interviews, talked to people about, what movie theaters they went to, some people from movie theaters, and then also talked about, here's kind of the story of Santikos, which is a theater chain in San Antonio, and, other kinds of ways that you can not only use an interview, but, information to put together. This is the story of this thing that happened, which is still relevant to this overall topic. So yeah, I mean, I think for me, really making that balance between interviews and then pulling it all together with distilling those, key points that came through, and then that element too of like personal stories. So there were several times throughout Texas Film in Focus and the Creative Potluck where I kind of share my personal stories about something, what I learned, and then map that back to the overall topic that we're talking about, which is something that I wouldn't necessarily be able to do as a filmmaker, right? Like, what medium or what genre of film would allow me to do that other than documentary? And that it in itself requires, an editor and someone who's like more visually practiced in that way. Like, I get really nervous in front of the camera. Like, even doing something like this, I'm kind of like, we can chat, we can freestyle and talk about podcasting, but I'm also so conscious of like being seen, and with podcasting, I'm just in my closet doing my thing, and it allows me to kind of riff and almost hear myself and create a story in that way. So yeah, very different from filmmaking. But in terms of similarities, though, I think creating that story and that plan, like script writing, is, I'm so lucky that I have that kind of practice in my back pocket, that I'm able to kind of read scripts and understand scripts, and also understand, oh, okay, this is what makes a story interesting. And is this a good enough payoff? So I think there are a lot of similarities also from the crew perspective too, right? Like working with an editor, communicating with an editor. I keep bringing that up because that was a big unlock for me. Like, when I made the decision to not edit my podcast, it made things so much easier because that was such a big hill to climb for me, time-wise. So yeah, being able to identify the right crew to help you do your admin stuff. Chloe Carcamo was helping me with Texas Film in Focus, and that really made the process a lot easier. Having that editor, having people who will Q&A, and then creative collaborators too. Like Tiff Voices was another show that I worked on. We were talking about Selena the series, and the folks that were on the show, Chelsea Hernandez and Sharon Arteaga, are also filmmakers. And so our perspectives were not only from the film perspective, but also as Selena fans. And so we were working together like a crew in the way that we were scheduling and all of that. So that's what made things really cool and really interesting. So I definitely encourage y'all, if you are filmmakers or working in the media space, take those skills and translate them into the podcast space, because it's definitely like an interesting way to challenge yourself. I'd love to talk a little bit about community engagement. Julie, you made really interesting you told us your story about getting that makerspace kind of up and running and engaging the community. And I know with the WIFT Austin podcast, there's an organization attached to it. And I know How to Texas really did a lot on social media. So I really want to dive into that community engagement part, because I think, getting in touch with your audience is super important. So love to hear from y'all. Also selfishly, because I want to know how to grow my audience too. Like I think that's an area where I can get better. So yeah, whoever wants to share first.
Well, since our audience is so very specific, it's very niche because it's basically, it's anyone who lives in our community. I've found, we do, we market over all the social media platforms and all of that. But what I've found to be most beneficial is reaching out to different organizations to help push it as part of their newsletters or as part of their direct communications with community members and direct emails and things like that. And I know that won't work for everyone, because if your audience is like broader than, a square mile radius, then, but I still think that there's a lot of value in tapping your network and helping and asking them to kind of help push an episode along or something like that to their groups. That can be a really fast way to build an audience. And then I actually got a couple of professors to assign it as homework to their classes. And so I don't know if you know anyone in the school system, maybe you can work out that deal.
That's great. Yeah. How about y'all, Chantelle? How is WIFT kind of activating the WIFT member base and getting listeners and engaging with the audience in that way?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, because we are an organization, it's pretty special because we already have these boundaries. We already have an audience. And so learning how to engage, how to connect, educate, support, and empower our membership base. For season 2, we've got a lot of feedback from our members as to what they actually want to be hearing about, what types of industry professionals, what topics they feel like is missing for them, like education-wise. So we are being very specific with season 2, which is exciting, and it also gives us a really nice guideline. So that I think is really great. And because we have already a season, we've been able to step it up with production. We do have Austin Public partnering with us this season. So we have a studio to actually record in, which means our quality is going to be elevated, which is really exciting. We still have to figure out how to use that studio. It's pretty fancy.
It is very fancy. Lots of buttons to push. Yes. I actually have my training today, so it's very new, very fresh, but very exciting.
Ask all the questions.
Yes, yeah. Taking notes.
Yes.
How about you, Frances? And How to Texas? I know y'all were really doing a lot with engaging folks on social.
Yeah, so the thing about the Texas film industry, as you know, Sam, it's just really special. Like, one of the reoccurring themes that came up in our interviews is that, like, why Texas? Like, why working in Texas? And the crew members that we interviewed, they were all like, everyone in Texas works super hard and they're super nice. And so, like, the niceness of that community definitely worked in our favor as far as for social media campaigns, just because the Texas film world is small and people are working together, and you want to work with like kind and hardworking people, right? So through our social media, our How to Texas _podcast, if you'd like to visit it on Instagram, we did little mini campaigns. Like, we would say like, tell us your favorite person to work with on set. Like who's like, shout out a crew member, and people would tag their friends and just their mentors, people they looked up to on set. And it was really wonderful for that community building, not just for the podcast, but also because the film community itself is super close knit. And an example of where, you know, our listeners connected. We had a listener who listened to the stunts episode with Jeff Schwan, and he reached out to us to let us know that he reached out to Jeff based on our stunts episode and is now a stunt performer. He's doing
oh my gosh.
Yeah, which was crazy.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it was super cool. And then we had an example of we would include some film clips on social media being like, this is what, for example, like Bobby, Colorado, these ants in this scene, there's a scene in 3 Burials of Melquiades Estrada where ants crawl up a dead body. And so she was in charge of those ants. And the actor that was supposed to be the dead body reached out to us. His name's Julio. He's incredible. And he was like, I love Bobby. Here are some other people that you should interview and other incredible crew members. So I think the Texas film community is just really open to that kind of thing. And then even a shout out to Hyperreal Film Club, because they had their own built-in audience. And I know that they had supported us, How to Texas, with a grant, and also you, Sam, and they were always like promoting the new episodes that were coming up. And it was just really cool to be like, hey, Sam is my cousin podcast, you know, like, please, like, go listen to her episodes. They're amazing. And then it was vice versa. It was just people giving back to each other. It was really cool.
Yeah, absolutely. Hyperreal was a lot of help during Texas Film in Focus for me. And like, you know, we got a lot of submissions too. Like, who did you want to hear? Like, that was my call to action every episode was, who do you want to hear from? So the last episode of the 12-part series for me is basically just folks who, you know, came to me through other people. So I was doing a lot of outreach, a lot of like Instagram DMs, like, hey, send, like, can I get your email? I want to talk to you about this. So yeah, a lot of just kind of like internet interaction. And then also for TIFF Voices, I had a really interesting story that I really only shared with my co-hosts at this point, but I in my day job, I was working with this group of people who, like, it's very like I&D focused for this like project. And one of the women is from Mexico, and she had just moved to the States, and I told her about my podcast, and she was like, oh, I know about Selena. And so I was like, yeah, you know, series is, you know, people are talking about the series, and we're part of that discourse, that online discourse. And so a couple months went by. She told me that on their vacation back to Mexico, her daughter, who had been born in the United States, started listening to the show and watching Selena and like understanding why Selena is the icon that she is. And I was just like, oh my God, this is why we did this podcast. You know, like, we want there to be representation on screen. We want there to be representation in the podcast space. Like, that was just kind of a moment for me that I was just like, all right, all of those times of like really having to hustle to get these episodes done was totally worth it, because this kid is now in touch with her roots a little bit more and can see herself on screen. So that was just a thing that, like, for me, not really understanding my audience before that moment really, like, it meant a lot. So wanted to share that with y'all, because I don't think anyone else has heard that story. So yeah, I think we've got a couple of questions. Let's look at the chat. We've got a couple of people shouting out WIFT, people shouting out the film community. Great to be here. Thanks for coming, y'all. We're so excited to talk to y'all. Okay, so let me go into the Q&As. So if you can go into the Q&A section, you can upvote questions that people have already submitted, and then you can go ahead and submit. The top voted question is one that I'm not sure if we're going to be able to truly cover today. Do y'all cover podcasts and making Google ads that direct toward podcast/blog/video content? Meaning Google talks a lot about storytelling methodologies for 6-second videos or masthead video ads. Is that something that y'all could address? So in short, no. But I think that aspect of podcasting is very much related to like digital paid ad space in general, right? So like my day job is working in digital marketing, and those two worlds, while they collide, are also very different, right? How like your ad spend and how you're utilizing which channels and those kinds of things. So I feel like that might be like a podcast 2.0, like podcast marketing 2.0 that maybe we can do for next year's forum, or in another space. But I love that you're asking that question. That's super important and something that I think, should definitely be talked about. Just maybe not here. So sorry. But the next one is, what tips / suggestions do you have for someone who doesn't necessarily have a podcast voice? Any vocal tips? Thanks. And that's from Jessica Barrett. Does anyone have any podcast voice tips for Jessica?
I am someone who gets, I'm a shy public speaker. I get nervous public speaking, and my tip would be not so much like vocal specific, but more in the storytelling aspect of it, like finding your angle. Like there's a lot of podcasts out there. So what makes your podcast different? It's not necessarily that you need to have the best voice. It's more like, what are you saying that's different from all these podcasts? Like really breaking through the noise.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah, I saw that question and I really felt that, because I don't have a podcast voice, and my co-host, he ccame from radio, so he's got the voice. And next to him, I feel like this tiny mouse and squeaky. And so we've had to the way that we've balanced it is just he has a very different communication style than I do, and my voice fits my communication style. So our kind of co-host personas have kind of gone in these different directions, so that together we work really well. But by myself, I'm right there with you. I feel like I don't have the voice quite right. But it's definitely doable, and I think to what you said, what you're talking about really is what matters, and that's what people are tuning in to hear.
Yeah. You could also look at doing some voiceover classes. I know Sam did. Was it Southwest Voices?
Yeah, shout out to Southwest Voices. They have all kinds of classes. And I specifically went for the voiceover animation because I was like, that sounds fun. And it was. I mean, it truly is like voice acting. But there are a lot of just kind of general voice exercises that you can do. Like for me, breathing is like, as I'm talking and like controlling my breathing is a really like tough thing for me to do. And I didn't know that until I was aware of it. Right. So a lot of these things that you might not be aware of are things that you can kind of become more conscious of through going through these types of classes. So Southwest Voices is a really great resource. Also, there are a bunch of voice podcasts that you can listen to and follow those folks. Some of them have newsletters sending you tips and things like that. So yeah, it can direct you there.
I'd also
go ahead.
Sorry, before we move on to the next question, I would also suggest if you have your podcast idea ready and you've already recorded something, like if you have an editor, if you're looking for an editor, like How to Texas, we would spend we try to keep it down to an hour, but really it would be like 2.5 hours of talking. And our editor, Sam, shout out to Sam, she really, because Drew and I, we talk and we laugh and I personally say the word a lot during a studio day. And so an editor can also really help you create that illusion of seamlessness when you're speaking, and you have that specifically in a audio medium like podcasting.
Yeah. And also as you go through this process, you start to learn those things too. So I hate the process of editing my own voice, but when I listen to an edited version, I'm like, oh, she cut out all these things that I shouldn't be doing. Let me be more conscious of that. So yeah, you'll definitely trial and error. You'll learn as you go. The next question, which is upvoted with 5 votes from Wendy Padden, also from a podcast / vlogging standpoint, what platform do you feel you've been able to get the highest conversion rate for client retention and product interaction? So we've got some tech folks in the house. Those are absolutely, those types of words. And I think this is a conversation that I'm actually also engaging with in my day job about our podcast for Spinning Up. And I think one of the major points here is the purpose and content within your podcast, right? If you are creating a podcast specific to your product and you're directing people there, or they are tools for adoption, things like that, the content of your show then lends itself to that. If you're creating a show that's a bit more thought leadership, to put your brand in the space, you're not necessarily going to have that kind of conversion and product interaction. So I think it really comes down to like the purpose of your show. And then from there, thinking through, you know, is this a visual thing where we should be on YouTube? Is this an audio thing where it can be small, quick bites that people can get tips so that they're better adopting our product? So again, I also feel like that part of it also falls under that, the marketing aspect. So any other thoughts from anyone else here, if you've got any experience in that world?
Not so much.
All right, cool. Yeah, definitely great questions to be asking though. Next question from Matt Miller. Do y'all think podcasting is substituting or supplementing traditional radio? That's a good question.
I would say supplementing. I'm a big nerd. I love NPR. NPR is my favorite. I grew up my dad listens to All Things Considered every weekday, and I grew up with this person, and we listen to that every day. And I think that one of the big inspirations for the How to Texas, like the format for our show, was Radio Lab. Like Sam Drew and I really love Radio Lab, and we wanted to do something that was celebrating Texas filmmaking, but also creating this like immersed experience, right? Like all the different sound cues, and you feel like you're going somewhere, or you're like feeling a certain emotion from the sound that's created. I think it is definitely enhancing the experience, because podcasts are going onto radio, and someone who, like Julie was saying, that her co-host is from radio. Like I would love to see what Julie says.
Oh, well, I agree 100% with the supplementing. And I think what we're seeing a lot of is that crossover of mediums where, I mean, your favorite TV, and I'll just, for me, it's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. I love the show. And so, now they brought on a podcast to talk about episodes, and so we're seeing like a lot of, I think, crossover from different mediums to podcasting, and then podcasting launching certain narrative stories into other mediums. And that's really cool, because that, as we said kind of earlier, kind of the low cost barrier to entry, you spin up a podcast, it gets really popular, and it could go across, many different mediums if it's got the audience for it.
Yeah, podcasting is still a very new medium too. So we can lend from radio, definitely. And we are bringing in creatives from all over. Anyone can make a podcast, from comedian to producer to housewife to, dog owner. It doesn't matter.
Yeah. That the accessibility and almost democratization of the medium allows it to be a space where people like us can just have an idea and spin up podcasts. Whereas, radio, there might be a few more gatekeepers and asking that needs to happen. But yeah, absolutely supplemental in all of those ways, where radio kind of establishes those best practices, establishes kind of how we're storytelling through this audio medium, and then podcasting opens it up to more creative voices and a lot of opportunity there. So yeah, definitely supplemental, I think. Yeah. Okay, next question. What kind of support do podcasters need? Asking if those needs are jobs I can perform for them. So that's a good question. Basically, what are jobs that I can help podcasters with? Yeah, does anyone want to take that question?
Marketing, editing. We have a really good intern program, and I had a really good intern, and from outlining episodes to fully fleshing out scripts to, learning how to edit was huge for her. And then the marketing piece, and eventually like the monetization piece, are really big needs. So
yeah,
if you're a
absolutely.
money
Creating.
person, if you're a money person, you got a job.
Yes.
Totally.
Exactly.
yeah.
If you can market something, absolutely. Creating social posts, digital assets, writing copy, those kinds of things that you're going to need to promote the show, and SEO optimized transcripts, managing websites, a lot of these digital marketing kind of things, and a lot of things are done virtually too. So you could be almost a virtual assistant for a show, if that's something you're seeking out. So any other thoughts on that one? Cool. Okay. All right, let's keep going. There are a lot of really great questions here. Oh, okay. With so many podcasts being created and the medium exploding in recent years, how do you suggest a new show break through?
Finding your angle, which I know is such a cop-out answer, but it's like, why is your voice unique? Like, why are you telling the story and how you're telling it? And like, all podcasts are different, right? Like with How to Texas, we were really focusing on like specifically Texas film and the Texas film community and the crew members that normal moviegoers don't hear a lot about, right? But you could also just be the four of us talking as friends, but what are we talking about? Like with Julie, it's specifically stuff that's happening in Tyler, like finding what your specific angle is. And that can be anything, I think, is the only way to break through that noise. I would also say something practical like marketing, as well as like if you know who your audience is, like also trying to really market to them.
Yeah,
Mhm.
your niche is really important.
Yeah, once you do figure out who your audience is, it is a lot easier to find them too, on social media, and start, direct messaging people. Don't be afraid to reach out. Don't be afraid to follow people.
Yeah. And really finding that, or sorry, go ahead, Julie.
And I was just going to say, at the end of the day, everything really is kind of about relationships. So, the more that you can bring organic relationships into that, the more you can spread your content.
Yeah, I love that. And I think also asking yourself that question of like, why am I the one telling this story, or why am I the one bringing this topic to light? Are you an expert or are you curious? And for all of my shows, I am not an expert. I am not an expert in anything in the whole wide world. And so I bring that curiosity aspect. I will ask questions, and maybe ask questions that might feel very rudimentary or whatever. But I think that's what makes it interesting, right? Like, you're gonna learn something from me asking all of my questions. So thinking about that, thinking about your structure too. Is it only interviews? Is it interviews and a roundtable? Is it interviews and, cutting in some kind of audio performance, storytelling performance? I don't know if y'all are familiar with like The Moth, but people being able to kind of come and share their perspectives. So really thinking about your angle, where you sit in terms of expert or not expert, the format of the show, and then of course the content of the show too, right? Is it unique in any way? Is it specific to a region? Is it specific to an audience? Like, getting closer to understanding your niche and who that audience is going to be what sets you apart. Thanks for that question. That was Stephen McCaig who asked that one. Abby Esterly asks, any good templates out there for writing interview structure? I feel like a lot of those things I Googled and kind of mashed together. And then a lot of it was also trial and error. And then also it all evolves. So you can start with kind of a template and something that you might model from something that you've gotten inspiration from, and then, kind of adapt it to the way that you want to format your show. Do any of y'all have any resources on the podcast structure script part of things?
You were my resource, Sam. So
yeah, I definitely freestyle. The WIFT one, I was kind of like, I guess this would be interesting. Yeah, we had a segment where we had like member spotlights where our WIFT members would have a voice on the show, and then an interview, and then we had news, and then we had movie reviews, and that's evolved over time. But it was basically like, how do we fit in all of the things that we think would be interesting and then iterate over time?
Yeah. What we've always done is very, very loose. And that way when we're in there, because most of what we do is interview based. So we have very organic conversations, and we have like some bullet points, or these are the high notes that we want to hit. We want to make sure we ask questions that get to the heart of these issues. But we don't do it overly scripted unless we're doing like a historical piece where you would need some intricate detail about the history. Just because we want it to feel organic. And we've got in sometimes without a script, it's an issue on the fly that's important, and we're just going to sit down and we're really going to get into it and fight about it a little bit sometimes. So.
Yeah. And I mean, when you have these organic conversations too, it might change the script a little bit, right? Like your outline might end up being thrown out the window if something really juicy happens, or you're having a really great conversation. So allowing space for that kind of organic discussion is super important too. So thanks for that question. Next question, also from Stephen McCaig. Are there any trends that you're spotting as a sign of next generation podcasting?
Well, someone was talking about like the live streaming, and that's definitely something that we're about to pick up, which I don't like being on camera. So I'm really, we've got Mevos and stuff, and I'm not thrilled about it, but I know it's going that way. And I think accessibility is getting better, like with AI being able to do like translate or translating your voice and things like that. And I think that we're going to see a bigger push for that accessibility piece as we move forward. For sure. And to your point about 52% are listening, which means 48. Did I do math right? I don't do math, but I think that's 48%.
Math is correct. Confirmed.
There's still a big swath of the population that that we can reach out to, and as that audience base grows, I think again the monetization piece, seeing more advertising, I think that's going to be big.
Yeah, that's the thing too. The lives, live events are something that you can monetize as well, which we're seeing more of. And definitely people figuring out how to just monetize podcasts in general.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of like affiliate marketing, those kinds of like sponsorship promotions that you see. But I think, the more, I guess, advanced, I don't know if it's advanced, but the podcasts that I see kind of evolving are the ones that are utilizing their show and their show's brand to create like a content ecosystem. So they'll have a Patreon, they'll have social media presence, they'll have, exclusive live streams or way to engage with them and their hosts. And those things that really essentially foster community through different forms of content is really what I'm seeing a lot of the more successful podcasters, quote unquote, successful podcasters, the ones with the bigger audiences or I guess community. I don't want to say people with the biggest audiences are the best podcasters. So those are the ones that I'm seeing like innovating, and really creating an experience with their audience. So great question. And then Robert Rodriguez from the team, who's the guest you are most excited to have on your podcast? I'll go last because I'm totally going to gush.
I know Sam's for sure. I really enjoyed interviewing Kat Candler. Her career is really remarkable, and she is just such an incredible human and very, very generous with her knowledge. And it was a very inspiring interview.
I'll piggyback off of that. I was a student of Kat Candler's back in the day, and she is an awesome human and really cool. And we mentioned we didn't interview Kat, but we did mention her. We mentioned her quite a few times in the podcast. But I think my biggest the interviewee that I was most excited to interview was Bobby Colorado, mostly because she's a living legend, and I had never interviewed anyone for a podcast before I had interviewed Bobby. So I was coming in.
She was your first?
She was my first. And I called her and I was like, listen, I'm a filmmaker and I want to make a podcast with my friends about filmmaking and crew members and people who don't get their dues. And like, we want to talk about the people behind the scenes. And she's like, great, I'm in. And that was it. Like, she was fine with it. And I had never met her in person. And I showed up to her home and we recorded the interview, and she had these incredible stories. And afterwards, she was like, I think it goes back to the testament of like the Texas film community and people being super open and kind and willing to help. Like if you put your podcasting needs out there, I think people will bring it back. And like Bobby was one of those examples where she was like, we did our interview and I loved my episode, but let me know if you need any other recommendations, other people from set to bring on. And I think also having Bobby on the podcast as that first episode really gave us a level of like credibility. Other people from Texas film crews were like, oh yeah, I heard Bobby's episode, I'll be on your next episode. And we were like, that's awesome. And it felt so good, especially like Sam, Drew, and I, we come from the Texas film production world, and we've been out of it for a little bit because we've been doing some office jobs. But it was just super cool to have somebody be like, you're new, but it's okay, and I'm going to tell you all my stories. It was incredible.
That's so cool. What a great way to like connect with someone, you know, in like a very different new way, you know? Yeah, for me, it was definitely Elizabeth Aveyan. Like it was a long time for me to get to the point of being comfortable enough to even make the ask, because she's just somebody that I've admired for a really long time. And I'll tell a cringe story really quick. So when I graduated from college, I had no idea what I was doing and had sent like Robert Rodriguez and Elizabeth Aveyan like my resume in a packet, like a physical packet. And I don't even know if the address was right. Anyway, I shot my shot, didn't hear back. Fine. But like, that's just not how you do things. I didn't know that. Anyway, fast forward to like 13 years later, I'm interviewing her, and she is one of the most approachable women I've ever met. She had such great stories. I feel like we connected in a really great way. She had all of this really great advice. And I had just like, you know, when they say like, don't meet your heroes, you know, because you're going to be like disappointed. I very much have experienced that in the past. And I was just like, oh no, what if it like changes the way that I see her? But it just made me respect her even more. And she just has so much really great insight. So plug that episode if you want to listen to the WIFT Austin podcast. That episode is live. So yeah, it was really great. But also should, you know, caveat that like I've interviewed a lot of people in just the past couple of months, and so many people, like I've left the interview being like, oh my God, I was not expecting to have that conversation with this person, and I was not expecting to be so blown away. So yeah, there's a lot of really great stuff out there. And I think that's one of the joys of being an accidental podcaster is like, oh, I accidentally got into this really great conversation with somebody, and now I've learned so much, or I'm inspired in a new way. And yeah, so I would say close second, everyone else I've interviewed. Great. Well, I want to give some shout outs in the chat before we wrap it up, because that is the end of our questions. Unless anyone else has any more, we are wrapping it up. But Kiara's in the room. It was super crucial in all of the marketing with WIFT Austin. Wendy's been submitting a bunch of questions. Thank you, Wendy. Matt, Dana from WIFT, Sharon and Chelsea are here. Shout out to Tiff Voices. Let's see who else. Eduardo Román, just hyping us up throughout the show. Thank you, everybody. Y'all have been really great, and we are so excited to have been able to talk to you today. So thank you all.
Yes, thank you so very much to all four of you, Sam and Julie and Chantelle and Francis. We really appreciate such a fun way to close out day one of our Women in Tech and Innovation Forum, presented today by the Governor's Commission for Women, as well as the Texas Film Commission, AT&T, and SEMPRA. So thank you for joining us. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks, y'all.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.